because I unconsciously define the worth and value of my stories based on the likelihood that I can publish the story, which is maybe not healthy. Okay. So obviously I've shared a lot about my writing projects over the past year on this channel. And, you know, I never want to create the illusion that things are always going well for me, writing wise, and that I'm super productive all the time and I'm always happy with my writing. Because I think sometimes in the vlog format, things seem a lot better than they are. I mean, obviously I've had vlogs where it's also very difficult, but with the vlog format in particular, it's very informal. So I'm kind of just like talking off the top of my head. And I felt like this was a topic that warranted its own a little bit more put together video. First things first, obviously, I'm not trying to convince you to quit your project or anything like that. I'm not like trying to make this a sign for you to literally stop writing whatever project you're currently writing and stuck on. But if you're like me and maybe having a hard time pulling yourself out from the depths of not a writing slump, but something much worse than that, like you can feel that it's much worse than a writing slump. Yeah, I just kind of wanted to talk through my own experience with that feeling, what made me accept and come to the realization that it was time to quote unquote quit writing a book that I loved. I think what hurts the most about quitting this book in particular is that it was the longest project I'd ever actively held on to. It was the first fantasy story I finished, and it was the first project that I vlogged about on this channel. So some of you guys have like followed the journey of me writing some of it or even finishing it, right? The book is Project Moon, by the way. I didn't even say that. I never really got a real title that I was happy with for this story, so I've just been calling it Project Moon. If you want context about that project, you can watch my reflection video on it or any of my early vlogs. But long story short, I wrote it on and off for 3 years, and in my gut, I knew around like the 70-ish% mark of it, I knew that something was off. Eventually, I sort of just like watched the whole plot crumble to dust in my hands. Essentially what happened was like, just I thought I had outlined the story and then nothing really went the way I wanted it to go, you know? Plot points were not unraveling nicely, character arcs and motivations were lacking, the world building lacked a lot of thought. It was muddled and the lore was also not well thought out enough, you know? And when I was initially outlining it, I just didn't really have the experience and the foresight to see what the story was lacking. It literally took me writing, I don't know, 75 or maybe 60 to 70,000 words of it before I realized that. And here's the thing, I have said, and I still believe, that editing can save any scene, any book, anything, you know? And like, I firmly believe that if I had set my mind to it, I could fix the story. I could take all the lessons that I learned and I could rewrite the story, and it could be great, because it also, the writing the book did teach me a lot of lessons. But I think there was something about being stuck in that world with those characters that felt really creatively stifling. Like I said, I was writing this on and off for 3 years, and by the end of that draft, my passion for the story really fizzled. When I wrote that first draft, I looked at it in retrospect and I just thought it was so bad. I had kind of convinced myself that it must mean that I'm a bad writer. I sort of quietly thought that for weeks, if not months. And it wasn't until I started writing a new book and I started getting into a new world that I was able to get out of that negative mindset. But it took a really long time, and I think I just had a lot of self-loathing. Yeah, that was the truth of it. I was really not in a good creative place after I finished writing Project Moon. The question with a bad first draft is always, why not revise it? Most of it came down to passion and motivation. Project Moon put me through the ringer for 3 years, and by the end of draft 1, I didn't want to get back into it. I know that the process of revising and like seeing the story in a new light and, you know, just like buckling down and writing it, it can help you rekindle your passion for the story. But just going back to what I was saying earlier, every time I thought about truly revising this book, the more time that passed, I realized it wasn't that I couldn't revise the book, it was that I just didn't want to. Revision would literally mean gutting the story open, taking its organs out, and transplanting new ones, you know? There were fundamental problems with this story that couldn't be fixed with line editing and, you know, a couple developmental edits or whatever. Like, I would have had to go into the bones of this story and rebuild it pretty much from the ground up. And mentally, that was just too stifling for me. To be stuck in the same world for 3 years made it feel like I wasn't progressing as a writer, even though that's not, you know, true. Because I think the more you write, the better you get, no matter what you're writing or whatever. I truly felt like creatively I needed to prove to myself that I was capable of writing something good outside of the context of this world, because that world was beginning to feel like my comfort zone almost. You write iterations on the same story for 3 years. It starts to feel like the only thing you know. And I just had to get out of it, I think. Basically, I needed to feel like I was progressing in my writing journey that went somewhere beyond this like box I had put myself in. The other thing, and I think this is the most important thing that made me realize that it was probably time to let go of this story indefinitely, was honestly, I had just outgrown it. I started writing Project Moon, like the first iterations of it, probably when I was like 18, 19. And I think the writer that I was at that age, the person that I was at that age, is not who I am anymore. There are other types of stories, other themes that are interesting to me now. And I think the fact that I was outgrowing this book really contributed to why I felt stifled at the prospect of rewriting it. And after finishing draft 1, the only reason I finished it was because I wanted to like close the chapter, so to speak, on my journey with this book. This is gonna sound bad, but it wasn't because I believed it was like good enough for publishing. I literally forced myself to finish it just so that I could be at peace with myself. And so when I came to like the harsh realization that it really wasn't good, I felt a lot of guilt over that, because it felt like I'd shared so much of this project on my channel only to be like, just kidding. The book actually sucks. What contributed to that guilt was also recently, and this is actually the reason that I was like prompted to film this video, was because I did a couple line editing videos featuring excerpts from this project. And, you know, I just did them for fun. I had already accepted for the last few months that Project Moon was like a very, very, very low priority project for me. But, you know, I felt like doing some line editing for fun. I felt like filming a video, so I pulled excerpts from that project. You know, I wasn't expecting the videos to like perform particularly well or anything like that. But when I uploaded them, I got so many kind words and so much positive feedback for the story and the characters. And for a second, it made me feel like, oh, I really should revise this. Because, you know, in these little moments, like there's pockets of the story that I really enjoy and that I think are not bad, and other people enjoy them too. And that was like shocking for me because I don't think I really had much positive validation for Project Moon before, especially when I posted the video featuring Mito and Aston's characters, who are like 2 of the 4 main characters in the book. The response was so encouraging. People had so many positive words for them, and I love them so much, but I had like convinced myself that the story was like objectively bad. And so, I was just kind of hit with this guilt, not because I felt like I owed people, but it was more like I felt guilt for like my past self, if that makes sense, because my teenage self or whatever was so passionate about this story, and I felt like me as an adult, I was like giving up on it. And I love Mito and Aston too. I love the characters in this book. Like I said, while I do feel like moment to moment interactions between the characters are compelling, some of them, and there are like some good parts of the story, the wider narrative is not cohesive. I wrote it and outlined it at a time when my writing skills weren't as developed. It's worth noting as well that I think the reason I was getting so caught up with feeling guilt over quitting the project is because I unconsciously define the worth and value of my stories based on the likelihood that I can publish the story. Which is maybe not healthy. Maybe it's not healthy. I know, you don't have to tell me. What I am unlearning every single day is that I can write a good story. I can write something that has value. And even if no one reads it, doesn't mean the story's not good. I understand that external validation is important. Like, I've talked multiple times on the importance of external validation as a writer, as a creative. I've literally made like a whole video about fan fiction and why so many writers find their passion for writing first in fandom spaces. It's because of external validation. I know that a lot of writers just write for themselves, but I'm talking more for like writers who are like me and have this like toxic relationship with writing where it's just like, all we think about is publishing, right? In like a non-healthy way. Yeah, publishing defines so much of my self-worth. I think that's just messed up. Like, it's great to be motivated by something, but also it's a little messed up. It's taken to the point where like you can't even like focus on the writing, or you can't even enjoy the writing anymore. I think that's when I realized that I really needed to like reevaluate my relationship with writing as a whole. Sure, is Project Moon good enough to query an agent and like get a book deal with it? No, not even a little bit. But is the entire story bad? Also, no. If it was bad, then like I wouldn't go back sometimes to read it, or I wouldn't go back sometimes to line edit it for fun, because there are moments in that book that I love and I can look back on it and be like, yeah, I had a fun time writing that. What can I say? Mito and Aston's chapter is just one example. Like, I loved writing their interactions. I loved playing around with that character dynamic, and writing the small interactions between those characters did bring me a lot of joy. And that's why I shared a little bit of it on my channel. I wouldn't have shared it if I didn't like it. I think the other thing that was really valuable about the journey of writing this book was it was the first time that I'd written like a true multi-POV story, like a 4-person multi-POV narrative. And that taught me a lot about, pacing and character voice, which I genuinely feel was like a super valuable lesson for me. So I think it would be unfair and cruel of me to say, to my past self or whatever, story is objectively bad or that it's not good enough, because I think if you take away publishing as a factor, the writing does have value because it taught me something. Doesn't that count for something? That every project we work on is making us better writers? It was fun to write. It brought me joy to write, and it still brings me joy to look back on some of the moments in the book. So is it time to quit your book? I'm not telling you to quit your book, like I said. And as I always say, I don't believe necessarily in the word like quitting when it comes to not like deciding not to work on a project anymore. I like to see it more as shelving, because you never know if or when pluck it out and work on it again. Like, you really never know. In my experience, sometimes shelving or letting go of a project has been good for me. The moment I knew was like every time I thought about working on it, every time I thought about revising it, it was causing me more grief than excitement. And that's not to say that heavy revisions or perseverance isn't worth it, because I do think that that's a writing skill in and of itself, is like learning how to get over those humps. But for me, pushing myself through a revision process that I wasn't passionate about even a little bit made me have negative connotations with writing as a whole, and in turn it made writing feel like a chore. In general, you know, writing is always like this delicate balance of powering through a writing slump and chasing your joy / project hopping. And there's no perfect formula or perfect balance that like works for everyone. What I will say about my current book that I'm revising is that while I do go through writing slumps with it, now that I'm revising it and now that I feel like I'm a better writer than I was like 1 or 2 years ago, I can sort of instinctually feel when it's time to buckle down and revise and, you know, keep revising it, versus when it's time to take a break and go and write something new for a bit. And another thing that made me quit Project Moon and not Nightward, which is my current whip, is that with Project Moon, I lost passion for the core story and the core world. And that's when I knew that it was time to move on from it. Whereas with Nightward, even after it's been at least a year since I started drafting it, and now I'm redrafting it, I find new things in the world or new aspects of the character arcs that excite me. So even though my motivation dwindles, and even though I go through these writing slumps, my passion and motivation never is fully gone. So I think that's the main difference. Like, if you're struggling with asking yourself whether it's time to put away a project and work on a new one, I think you'll just kind of feel it eventually, whether or not your motivation has completely slipped away. And sometimes you need a lot of time away from a story before you pick it up again, like sometimes years worth of time. So I don't think the process of like quitting or shelving should seem as permanent or as daunting as sometimes it can feel. Like, I don't think that writers should have to feel so much guilt about putting a project away for a little bit. Like, I hope as much as possible that I can sort of learn not to equate my worth or skill as a writer directly to how fast I can write a project or how perfect I can execute a story on the first try. I think what I've realized is that as long as I'm consistent with my writing, like I don't go more than like a couple days really without writing anything. And as long as I'm slowly pushing myself and giving my ideas time to breathe, I have felt myself improve. It might not seem like that on a daily basis, but I have. I think there are a lot of writers who are like, oh, I've never finished anything, so that means I'm a bad writer. Or if like, I've never finished anything, so it means that I never will finish anything. And that's simply untrue. Of course, having a support system, both online and IRL, has definitely helped me. I feel like if there was no one that I could talk to my writing about, or if I didn't have any kind of like semblance of a community, it would have been much harder to write over the past year or two. But, you know, with all of that said, I hope that I can one day publish a book that I'm proud of. Just because it's not this book, that's okay. Anyway, that is all for this video. If you guys have had any kind of similar experience with feeling guilty about not finishing a project, I would love to know. I was sort of like quietly having this like resentment for this book for a long time that I wasn't really talking about in my videos. And now that I have talked about it, I feel better. Thank you guys as always for watching, and I hope all of your writing projects are going well.